The air on Earth had changed. It was thick with desperation, an invisible haze that clung to every breath. Captain Ilara Morrow stood at the viewing window of the Exodus, the massive flagship of humanity's last hope. The sight of Earth, bathed in the golden glow of the dying sun, brought a lump to her throat. Once vibrant and teeming with life, her home now shimmered with the final echoes of civilization, a civilization that was running out of time. The sun, which for eons had been the giver of life, had turned hostile. Scientists had discovered only 2 years ago that a catastrophic solar explosion was inevitable. The event, a massive release of radiation and energy, would sweep through the solar system and render Earth uninhabitable. Cities would burn, oceans would evaporate, and life as they knew it would be extinguished. 2 years. That was all the time they had been given. Ilara's mind drifted to that fateful day when the world received the news that they were facing the apocalypse. It had been a moment that unified humanity in a way no war, no global treaty, and no shared culture ever could. The fight for survival transcended borders, wealth, and ideology. The world's governments came together, pooling resources into a massive endeavor: the construction of the Exodus fleet. Hundreds of ships, all built for one purpose: to carry humanity across the stars to a new home. After intense debate and exploration, they had found it, a planet orbiting a distant star, Aurelia, capable of sustaining human life. "Captain, we're ready for final launch preparations," came the voice of Commander Jacob Reyes over the comm. His deep, steady voice snapped Ilara back to the present. Reyes was her second in command, and though their methods often clashed, he was fiercely competent and dedicated to the mission. Ilara placed a hand against the window, her fingers brushing the cold glass as she gazed at the blue and green orb below one last time. "Acknowledged, Commander. I'll be on the bridge shortly." The command deck of the Exodus buzzed with activity when she arrived. Officers and technicians moved quickly through their tasks, checking systems, ensuring everything was ready for the launch that would carry them away from the solar system forever. "Status report," Ilara ordered as she stepped into the captain's chair. Reyes stood by her side, his rigid posture a contrast to the quiet chaos around them. "All ships in the fleet report readiness. We are waiting for your command, Captain." Ilara exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of her responsibility settle on her shoulders. Over 10 million souls were aboard the fleet, the best of what was left of humanity. Scientists, engineers, doctors, and their families. Everyone had been selected for their skills, chosen not just to survive, but to rebuild once they reached Aurelia, and they were counting on her to lead them. "Open a channel to the fleet," she said. A brief pause followed. Then a soft chime indicated that the communication link was established. Her voice would now carry across the void to every man, woman, and child on the Exodus and the other ships. "This is Captain Ilara Morrow," she began, her voice steady despite the monumental task before her. "Today we leave behind the only home we've ever known. Earth has been our cradle, our mother, for millennia, but now we must say goodbye. We venture into the unknown, but we do not go blindly. We go with hope. Hope that we will find safety on Aurelia. Hope that we will survive, and that humanity will continue." A pause, filled with the unspoken words, "Or we won't." She swallowed, steadying herself. "We do this for our children, and for their children. May we live to see a new dawn." "Engage engines." The command was simple, but the implications were profound. Engines hummed to life as the Exodus fleet began to move, pulling away from the planet that had nurtured them for so long. The stars stretched before them, a vast and endless expanse, while behind them, Earth shrank into the distance, becoming just another speck among the heavens. As the fleet picked up speed, Ilara's mind shifted to the future, Aurelia. It had taken decades to find a planet that could support human life, and even then, they knew precious little about it. It was green, lush, filled with forests, mountains, and vast oceans, but it was also inhabited. The Yexian, the native species, were intelligent, technologically advanced, and, according to their limited intelligence, fiercely protective of their world. For now, Ilara focused on the journey ahead. They had weeks, possibly months, before they arrived at Aurelia. There would be time to plan, time to negotiate, time to understand what kind of reception they would face. But a quiet unease gnawed at her. What if the Yexian didn't want them there? A hand fell on her shoulder, and she looked up to see Jacob Reyes watching her. "I know that look," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You're thinking about the Yexian." Ilara gave him a thin smile. "It's hard not to. They're not our concern right now. Our only job is to get to Aurelia. Once we're there, we'll deal with them." Ilara nodded, though Reyes' casual dismissal of the issue didn't ease her worries. And if they don't want us there, Reyes crossed his arms, his expression hardening. Then we make them understand that we have no choice. It's their planet or our extinction. That's a pretty compelling argument, she frowned. I'd prefer we avoid making demands. We're not making demands, Captain. We're surviving. There's a difference. Ilara didn't respond. She knew Reyes believed in action over diplomacy, but she wasn't ready to give up on peaceful negotiation. The Yexian had every right to protect their planet, and humanity would have to earn its place there. But with so much at stake, she feared that voices like Reyes would only grow louder if things didn't go according to plan. As the stars streaked past the viewing window, Ilara made a silent vow. Whatever it took, she would ensure that humanity's second chance would not be built on violence. The hum of the engines had become a familiar background noise, almost a comfort in the monotony of space. Days and nights no longer had meaning aboard the Exodus. Everything was measured in shifts and cycles. The fleet's journey to Aurelia, though filled with anticipation, had begun to feel like an endless voyage through darkness. Captain Ilara Morrow sat at her station on the command bridge, staring into the infinite void of space beyond the massive viewing window. Her mind wandered to the millions of lives depending on her on this mission for their survival. The responsibility was staggering. Some days the weight of it threatened to crush her. A soft chime from her console snapped her out of her thoughts. Captain Morrow, Lieutenant Davin's voice came through her comm. You should come to the bridge. We're picking up something unusual. In the cold expanse of space, that word could mean anything. Ilara quickly stood and strode out of her quarters. A sense of foreboding crept up her spine as she made her way to the bridge. When she arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Officers worked quickly at their stations, voices low but urgent. On the main display, a series of strange symbols and lines appeared to signal, but unlike anything they had encountered before. What's going on? Ilara asked as she approached her second in command, Commander Jacob Reyes, standing tall with his arms crossed, glanced at her with that steady, impassive look he always wore. We've intercepted a signal. It's coming from Aurelia. Ilara's heart skipped. The Yexian. Lieutenant Davin, the ship's communications officer, swiveled around in his chair. Captain, we've picked up what seems to be an automated transmission. The language is unfamiliar, but based on its patterns and structure, we're almost certain it's a form of communication from the Yexian. Ilara nodded. Can we translate? Davin shook his head, a look of frustration crossing his face. We're working on it, but the language is completely alien. It's not like anything we've encountered in our pre-mission research. Reyes stepped closer, his voice low but firm. This is our chance to make contact. Ilara, we can't just sit here and wait for them to decide what to do with us. She knew what he was getting at. Reyes had never been a patient man, and his distrust of the Yexian was no secret. He had been vocal from the start about taking a more assertive approach, pushing for humanity's right to survive at all costs. But this was too important to rush. We'll wait for a translation, she said calmly, but with finality. Reyes didn't argue, but the look he gave her said enough. Waiting is a mistake. Ilara turned her attention back to the main screen, watching as the symbols on the display shifted and changed. The Yexian knew they were here. That much was certain. But what would they think of the arrival of millions of human refugees? Would they see the fleet as an act of desperation, or as an invasion? Keep working on that translation, Ilara ordered. We need to know what they're saying before we respond. Hours passed as the team worked to decipher the alien transmission. Ilara stayed on the bridge, unable to tear herself away. The tension was palpable. Everyone could feel the weight of this moment. After all, they weren't just making contact with a new species, they were pleading for their survival. Suddenly, a small beep echoed through the command center. Davin straightened in his seat. Captain, we've made some progress with the translation software. We've got part of the message. Ilara stood, her heart quickening. Put it on the speakers. The crew went silent as the translation played out in a mechanical, stilted voice. This is Vixer, representative of the Yexian High Council. You are entering restricted space. Identify yourselves immediately, or be removed. The voice was harsh, authoritative, and unequivocal. Ilara exchanged a look with Reyes, who raised an eyebrow, clearly ready to launch into his usual argument. They're not asking for a negotiation, he said flatly. They're demanding an explanation. We need to be prepared for hostility. Ilara bit her lip, considering the implications. We don't know that yet. This could just be a standard protocol. We need to respond carefully. Reyes crossed his arms, his frustration evident. They're already showing their cards. Ilara, they don't want us here. We need to make it clear that we're not asking for permission. Her eyes snapped to his, her voice quiet but firm. I'm not giving up on diplomacy. Not yet. Riaz exhaled sharply through his nose but didn't push further. He knew better than to argue openly on the bridge, but his disagreement was obvious. Alara turned to Lieutenant Davin. Open a channel. After a brief moment, Davin nodded. Your live, Captain. Alara took a deep breath. This is Captain Ilara Morrow of the Exodus Fleet. We come in peace, seeking refuge. Our planet Earth has been rendered uninhabitable due to a solar explosion, and we have no choice but to seek asylum. We request a meeting with your leaders to discuss the possibility of peaceful coexistence. She paused, waiting. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. The bridge crew stood frozen, their attention locked on the speakers, waiting for any sign of a response. Then, the speakers crackled again. This time, the translation was smoother, more refined. You are trespassing on sacred ground, Captain Morrow. The Yexian do not accept outsiders. Turn back now or face the consequences. The words hit Alara like a punch to the gut. Turn back. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision before her. Turning back wasn't an option. They had nowhere else to go, but pressing forward could lead to disaster. Rise stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. We can't turn back. Ilara, you know that. They'll have to understand. She shot him a sharp look. I'm aware of the stakes, Commander. Her mind raced. How could they make the Yexian understand their desperation without coming off as aggressive? They couldn't afford to antagonize them, not when they were so close to finding a new home. Lieutenant, reopen the channel, she said finally. Davin hesitated. Captain, they've already issued a warning. I know, she interrupted. But we have to try. The channel was reopened. And Alara spoke again, her voice filled with the calm authority she had perfected over years of command. Vixer, we understand your concerns, but I assure you we have no intention of causing harm to your world or your people. We only ask for a place where we can survive. Our situation is dire, and we hope you will grant us the opportunity to discuss this further. The channel fell silent once again. The crew waited, breathless, for the response that would determine their future. When Vixer's voice returned, it was colder than before. The Yexian High Council will convene to discuss your request. Until then, you will remain in orbit. Any attempt to land on Aurelia will be met with force. The line went dead. The silence on the bridge was suffocating. Ilara felt the eyes of her crew on her, waiting for a response. But what could she say? The Yexian had made it clear they were not welcome here. Not yet, at least. Ria stepped forward, his voice low and serious. This is bad. Ilara, we can't just sit here and wait for them to make a decision. We need to take action. And what exactly do you propose? She shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. He didn't flinch. We send a team down. Show them we're serious about surviving. If they see how desperate we are, they'll have to negotiate. Alara shook her head. We're not starting this relationship with a show of force. That's not how we survive. It's not force, Reyes countered. It's survival. If they don't believe we're serious, they'll keep us in orbit until we're too weak to argue. She could see the fear behind his words. He wasn't wrong, but his approach was dangerous. One misstep, and they could spark a conflict they couldn't win. We'll wait, she said, her voice firm. The Yexian will come to a decision. If we act rashly, we'll only make things worse. Reyes clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned away and left the bridge without another word. Ilara stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Millions of lives were at stake. Every decision she made from this point on would determine the fate of humanity. Keep monitoring the signals, she told Lieutenant Davin, her voice quieter now. We need to know the moment they respond. As she left the bridge, her thoughts churned with uncertainty. The Yexian were not the welcoming hosts they had hoped for, and as much as she wanted to believe in diplomacy, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something dangerous. The next few days would be critical. If the Yexian refused them, humanity's future was in jeopardy, and if Rise decided to take matters into his own hands, they might not survive the consequences. Ilara felt the gravity of the situation weighing down on her as she walked through the corridors of the ship, her mind racing with the impossible choices before her. The days since the Yexian's warning passed in a tense, uneasy silence aboard the Exodus fleet. Life aboard the ship had become a waiting game, with every person on board acutely aware that their future now rested in the hands of an alien species they barely understood. The quiet hum of the engines was no longer a comfort but a constant reminder of their limbo. Ilara Morrow sat in the captain's quarters, staring down at the various reports and data streams flickering on her console. The fleet's resources were dwindling faster than expected. With millions of people on board the ships, rationing had become more severe. Supplies meant for a short-term journey were now being stretched to their limits as they waited for an answer from the Yexian High Council. Each day in orbit was a day closer to desperation. Her door chimed softly, breaking her focus. Alara exhaled slowly and straightened her uniform. "Enter," she called, already anticipating who it would be. Commander Jacob Reyes stepped into the room, his presence as rigid and imposing as ever. He moved with a military precision, his every action deliberate and measured. But even with his control, Ilara could see the frustration simmering behind his eyes. "We need to talk," Reyes said without preamble, his voice low but urgent. Ilara gestured to the seat across from her. Sid Reyes hesitated for a moment, then took the seat, leaning forward with his hands clasped in front of him. His jaw clenched as if he was holding back from saying what he truly wanted to. 3 days, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been 3 days, Ilara. We've heard nothing from them, I'm aware," she replied calmly, though inside she shared his frustration. Reyes shook his head, his brow furrowed deeply. "We can't just sit here waiting for the Yexian to make up their minds. Our people are running out of food. Resources are stretched thin and morale is crumbling. We need action, not hope." Ilara leaned back in her chair, meeting his gaze evenly. "And what would you have us do, Jacob? Land on Aurelia uninvited? Risk starting a war we can't win? I'd have us show them that we're not here to beg. We're here to survive, and if they're not willing to help, then we need to take what we need to survive. We can't afford to wait for their permission." Ilara's expression hardened, her patience with Reyes beginning to wear thin. "I'm not leading this fleet into an invasion, Jacob. We came to Aurelia seeking refuge, not conquest. We're not going to repeat the mistakes of Earth." Reyes' hands tightened into fists on the table. "This isn't about conquest, Ilara. It's about survival. You think the Yexian care about our plight? They're sitting in their cities, debating whether to let us starve in orbit. Meanwhile, our people are suffering. Every day that passes, we get weaker. You know as well as I do that we can't afford to wait forever." Ilara sighed, rubbing her temples. She knew he had a point. Supplies were running dangerously low, and unrest had already begun to spread among the fleet. But starting an outright conflict with the Yexian wasn't the answer. "We're not at the point of desperation yet," she said quietly. "We need to give diplomacy a chance. I'm not going to risk the lives of everyone aboard this fleet by rushing into a fight we can't win." Reyes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We can't wait for them to say no. They've already made it clear we're not welcome here. If we don't act soon, we'll be too weak to even put up a fight if they force us out." Ilara met his gaze, her tone firm. "And what if they are willing to help, but they just need more time to deliberate? We can't afford to lose their trust by acting rashly. We've come this far on diplomacy, Jacob. I'm not throwing that away just because we're getting anxious." Reyes stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. His hands were clenched at his sides as he spoke. "Anxious? Ilara, I'm not anxious. I'm realistic. The Yexian don't see us as equals. We're invaders to them. And every day we sit here waiting for their council to make a decision, we lose ground." He stopped and turned to face her again, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "We have the technology. We have the manpower. We can land on Aurelia and establish a foothold before they can react. Once they see we're not a threat to them, they'll have no choice but to negotiate. But if we keep waiting, they'll see us as weak." Ilara rose from her chair, her own frustration bubbling to the surface. "You're suggesting we make the first move in a potential conflict? Jacob, that's not survival. That's aggression. We're not here to take over their world, and what if it's the only way to ensure our survival?" Reyes shot back. "You're clinging to a hope that they'll suddenly change their minds and welcome us with open arms. That's not going to happen." The room fell silent as the two of them stood facing each other, the tension between them palpable. For a long moment, neither spoke, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Finally, Ilara broke the silence, her voice quieter but no less firm. "I'm not giving up on diplomacy, Jacob, not yet. We'll wait for their decision." Rhea's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might argue further. But instead he gave a curt nod, though the frustration in his eyes remained clear. "I hope you're right, Ilara," he said, his voice cold. "Because if you're not, it won't just be the Yexian who suffer the consequences." With that he turned and left the room, leaving Ilara standing alone with the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Fleet tensions. After Reyes left, Ilara sat for a long time in silence, her mind racing. She couldn't deny that he had a point. Resources were running low, and the fleet couldn't stay in orbit indefinitely. But the thought of making a move that could provoke the Yexian into violence was too risky. It wasn't just the survival of the fleet that concerned her, it was the future of humanity, the morality of their actions, the kind of world they were trying to create. She couldn't allow humanity's second chance to be marred by violence and conquest. But as the days passed with no word from the Yexian, The unrest on the Exodus fleet grew more intense. Whispers of dissent began circulating among the crew. Rumors spread quickly, fueling fear and anxiety. Some believed the Yexian would never let them land. Others, like Reyes and his supporters, believed they should take action before it was too late. Ilara's leadership was being questioned, and she knew it. On the lower levels of the Exodus, where most of the civilians were housed, the tension was almost palpable. Families huddled together in their small, shared quarters, watching the dwindling rations and wondering how long they could hold on. Children asked their parents when they would reach their new home, but there were no comforting answers. Dr. Malik Amani, the fleet's lead biologist, had spent the last few days working around the clock to try and find a solution. He had been tasked with studying the planet's environment remotely, gathering what data they could from orbit in the hopes of finding a way to safely integrate humanity into Aurelia's delicate ecosystem if the Yexian even allowed them that chance. Malik was a man driven by purpose. Before the disaster on Earth, he had dedicated his life to understanding ecosystems, always searching for ways to prevent the environmental collapse that had eventually come to pass. His passion for preserving Aurelia's natural environment was personal, and though he supported Ilara's diplomatic approach, he understood the fears of those who followed Reyes. In the cramped confines of his lab, Malik studied the data on Aurelia's atmosphere and ecosystems. From what little they had gathered, Aurelia was teeming with life. The planet's flora and fauna were complex and interdependent, much like Earth's had been before humanity's industrial march had pushed it to the brink. And yet, something about Aurelia's ecosystems troubled him. He noticed an irregularity in the data, something that suggested the planet wasn't as stable as it appeared from the outside. There were fluctuations in atmospheric readings that hinted at underlying environmental shifts, but without more data, he couldn't be certain. Ilara had been hopeful that the Yexian would be open to discussing coexistence, but if their planet was in a more fragile state than it appeared, the introduction of human settlements could tip the balance and cause irreparable damage. Malik's comm unit buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was Ilara. Dr. Amani. Her voice came through the speakers, steady but with a trace of weariness. Any updates on the environmental data? Malik ran a hand through his hair, sighing. I've found some inconsistencies in the atmospheric readings, Captain. I'm not sure yet, but there may be an underlying instability in Aurelia's ecosystems. There was a brief pause before Ilara responded. What does that mean for us? It means that if we settle on Aurelia, we'll need to be extremely careful. The introduction of human activity could have a more significant impact than we initially thought. If the Yexian are aware of this, it could explain their hesitation in allowing us to land. Ilara was silent for a moment. Understood. Keep working on it. Malik, I'll need a full report soon. As the comm line went dead, Malik leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He understood the stakes, but even he couldn't be certain what the right course of action was. Humanity needed a new home, but if settling on Aurelia would destroy the planet's delicate balance, they would only be repeating the mistakes that had destroyed Earth in the shadows of the Exodus, away from the watchful eyes of the command crew. Whispers grew louder. A group of settlers, those who had grown disillusioned with Ilara's leadership and the idea of waiting for the Yexian's decision, had begun meeting in secret. These were the people who followed Jacob Reyes, who believed that humanity's survival depended on taking action, not waiting for permission. They met in the bowels of the ship, in unused storage areas and maintenance shafts, exchanging rumors, fears, and plans. Among them was Levi Taran, a former military officer who had lost family during the chaos that preceded Earth's destruction. He had been an early supporter of Rye's more aggressive stance, and now he found himself leading the growing group of dissenters. We've waited long enough, Levi said to the small group gathered around him. Ilara's diplomacy is a dead end. The Yexian aren't going to let us land. They see us as a threat, and they're waiting for us to starve out here. There were murmurs of agreement, angry voices rising in frustration. We've got the technology, the manpower, and the will to survive, Levi continued, his voice growing more impassioned. Reyes has been right all along. If we don't act, we're sealing our own fate. We need to take what's ours, but what if they retaliate? One of the settlers asked, her voice shaky. The Yexian have the advantage. If we land without permission, they could destroy us. Levi shook his head. They won't. They don't want war any more than we do. If we establish a foothold on Aurelia and show them that we're not backing down, they'll have to negotiate. They'll have no choice. As Levi's words echoed through the dimly lit room, the mood among the settlers shifted. Fear and uncertainty were giving way to determination. Desperation had a way of fueling dangerous ideas, and for those who had lost everything, the promise of action was intoxicating. In the shadows of the fleet, A movement was growing, one that could shatter the fragile peace before it even began.